Welcome to Deep World Updates. Subscribe and press the bell icon for more updates. The Supreme Court's decision to strike down Trump-era tariffs sent shockwaves through Washington and Wall Street. Headlines blared, "Tariffs unconstitutional," a ruling that upended years of contentious trade policy. These tariffs had reshaped supply chains, divided businesses, and sparked global disputes. Now, in a landmark 6-3 ruling, the court declared them unconstitutional, challenging the president's power to act alone on trade. Outside the Supreme Court, reporters clamored for reactions as lawyers spoke of constitutional limits and the rule of law. Lawmakers, business leaders, and diplomats scrambled to understand the implications. The ruling marked the end of a turbulent era, and the start of a new, uncertain chapter in American trade. More than a legal defeat, it was a reassertion of congressional authority over foreign commerce. For decades, presidents had expanded their power to impose economic measures under emergency statutes. The court's decision drew a clear line: regulating foreign commerce is Congress's job. Importers and retailers, long burdened by tariffs, saw hope for lower costs and stable supply chains. But domestic industries that benefited from protectionism now faced renewed foreign competition and uncertainty. Workers in those sectors worried about job losses. The legal question was settled, but new economic and political challenges emerged. The nation now had to confront the consequences of a trade policy built on shaky legal ground. The court's words would echo for years, forcing a reckoning with the limits of executive power. The era of the imperial presidency in trade had been dealt a major blow. The balance of power was shifting back to Congress. America's approach to global commerce would never be the same. The Supreme Court's ruling was a direct rebuke of presidential overreach. The majority opinion made clear the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, was never meant for broad economic protectionism. The law was designed for genuine emergencies, terrorism, hostile states, not for imposing tariffs on allies. For decades, Congress had delegated sweeping trade authority to the president. Now, the court set limits. The president can't declare an economic emergency just to bypass Congress. Trade authority returns to Capitol Hill, forcing lawmakers to take a more active role. Future presidents will need congressional support for major trade measures, making policy more predictable and stable. Foreign governments and businesses welcome the change, hoping for less volatility. But Congress is slow and often divided, making consensus on trade tough. The president's ability to act quickly in a crisis is now constrained. The challenge balancing constitutional separation of powers with the need for economic agility. Washington must adapt to a new map of authority. The era of unilateral trade action is over. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, was passed in 1977 to let presidents respond swiftly to extraordinary threats from abroad. It replaced the broader Trading with the Enemy Act, aiming to limit presidential emergency powers. Under IEPA, presidents can block transactions and freeze assets during a declared national emergency. It's been used for sanctions against hostile states and to combat terrorism, contexts widely accepted as legitimate. The law's vague language, unusual and extraordinary threat, has allowed broad interpretation. Over time, presidents stretched its use beyond its original intent. The Trump administration's use of IEPA to target imports from allies was unprecedented. It redefined economic competition as a national security threat, a radical shift. Critics saw this as mission creep, turning IEPA into a tool for trade policy rather than targeted sanctions. The move triggered immediate legal challenges. The Supreme Court case forced the nation to confront the true limits of presidential emergency powers. The question, where does legitimate executive action end and congressional authority begin? The answer would reshape American trade law. The Trump administration's use of IEPA for tariffs was bold and controversial. They argued that unfair trade practices and global oversupply threatened America's industrial base and national security. By declaring a national emergency, the president bypassed Congress to impose tariffs, claiming it was vital for military readiness. Critics countered that economic competition from allies hardly qualified as an extraordinary threat. Many saw the move as a political maneuver, not a genuine security measure. The administration insisted on broad presidential authority, citing IEPA's language and the tradition of deference to executive judgment in security matters. Opponents argued this was a legal workaround to fulfill campaign promises. The debate centered on whether the courts should defer to the president's definition of a threat. Lower courts had often sided with the executive, but the unprecedented scope of these tariffs forced the Supreme Court to intervene. The case became a test of the limits of emergency powers. Was this about protecting America, or about expanding presidential reach? The answer would set a precedent for future administrations, the stakes, the very definition of national security and trade. The Supreme Court would draw the line. The legal fight over tariffs was a battle over the Constitution itself. Plaintiffs argued only Congress can regulate commerce and impose taxes, core constitutional powers. The government claimed the president's national security authority justified the tariffs under IEPA. The real question, can the president use emergency powers for economic protectionism? The Supreme Court said no, presidential authority under IEPA isn't limitless. The court ruled tariffs are fundamentally commercial regulation and taxation, not a response to a true emergency. The decision reaffirmed the separation of powers. Even in the name of security, the president can't override Congress's role in trade. The constitutional balance was restored. The tariffs hit American businesses and consumers hard. Manufacturers faced higher costs for imported materials, forcing price hikes or profit cuts. Supply chains were disrupted, and many industries suffered, even as some steel and aluminum producers benefited. Farmers were devastated by retaliatory tariffs, losing key export markets. Consumers paid more for everyday goods, with the tariffs acting as a hidden tax. Economic uncertainty slowed investment and job growth. Allies saw the U.S. as unpredictable, straining diplomatic ties. The tariffs undermined the global trading system America helped build. The effects rippled through balance sheets, livelihoods, and international relationships. The trade war's real cost was felt far beyond the courtroom. The legal challenge began quickly, led by importers and trade groups. Lower courts sided with the administration, citing presidential deference and IEEPA's broad language. Plaintiffs pressed on, convinced the constitutional stakes were too high. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, recognizing its significance for the separation of powers. Oral arguments focused on the limits of executive authority and the intent of IEEPA. Justices were skeptical of the government's broad definition of national security. The final 6-3 decision capped a years-long legal battle. The ruling was a victory for those seeking to rein in unchecked executive power. The case became a landmark in defining the boundaries of presidential authority. The judicial system proved its role as a check on the other branches. The Supreme Court's ruling recalibrates presidential power in trade. For years, Congress had ceded authority to the executive, but the court drew new boundaries. The president can no longer use emergency powers for sweeping trade policy. Major changes now require congressional approval, restoring a more democratic process. The president still retains tools for targeted responses to unfair trade practices or genuine emergencies. The ruling distinguishes between responsive actions and broad protectionism. The long-term effect, a renewed partnership between Congress and the president on trade. Both branches must adapt. Presidents must persuade, Congress must lead. Delegation without oversight is no longer an option. The new balance will be tested as global competition intensifies. The challenge making this partnership work for America's economic future. The Constitution's vision for trade policy is back at the center. The next chapter will be written by both branches together. The Supreme Court's decision closes one chapter and opens another. Industries must adapt quickly. Importers welcome relief, but protected sectors face new competition. Policymakers must support workers and communities through the transition. The ruling offers a chance to repair global relationships and rebuild trust with trading partners. America must reclaim its leadership in global trade through diplomacy and clear policy. The world has changed. Regaining lost ground won't be automatic. The decision reaffirms the separation of powers and the rule of law. It forces a deeper debate about the future of U.S. trade policy. Leaders must move beyond divisive rhetoric and find balanced solutions. Open markets bring benefits, but legitimate concerns of workers must be addressed. The constitutional balance is restored. Now, policy balance is the challenge. The path forward demands nuance, vision, and cooperation. The next era of American trade begins now.